Hi, welcome to Moments in History. I'm Linda Shenton Matchett, author, speaker, and history geek. While researching stories, I often unearth tons of intriguing historical information that doesn't end up in my books. So I've created this channel so I can share these tidbits with you. If you couldn't tell from the bonnet that I'm wearing, I'm going to be talking about the 1800s, specifically about the First Transcontinental Railroad. Did you know that before building the Transcontinental Railroad, it could cost as much as $1,000 to travel across the country? After the railroad was completed, the price dropped to below $150. A British mining engineer and inventor named Richard Trevithick built the first steam locomotive in 1802. 10 years later, the first commercially successful steam locomotive was built by John Blenkinsop, also a mining engineer and inventor. A dozen years later, the Salamanca, built by George Stephenson and his son, was the first steam locomotive to haul passengers on a public railway. However, it was not until 1830 that America's first steam locomotive made its debut. And over the next 2 decades, railroad tracks linked many cities on the East Coast. By 1850, some 9,000 miles of track had been laid east of the Missouri River. During that same period, the first settlers began to move westward across the United States. And this trend increased dramatically after the discovery of gold in California in 1849. The overland journey across mountains, plains, rivers, deserts was risky and difficult, and many westward migrants instead chose to travel by sea, taking the 6-month route around Cape Horn at the tip of South America, or risking yellow fever and other diseases by crossing the Isthmus of Panama and traveling via ship to San Francisco. In 1845, New York entrepreneur Asa Whitney presented a resolution to Congress proposing federal funding of a railroad that would stretch to the Pacific. Lobbying efforts over the next several years failed due to growing sectionalism in Congress, but the idea did remain a potent one. In 1860, a young engineer named Theodore Judah identified the infamous Donner Pass in Northern California, where a group of westward immigrants had become trapped in 1846, as an ideal location for constructing a railroad through the formidable Sierra Nevada mountains. By 1861, he had enlisted a group of investors in Sacramento to form the Central Pacific Railroad Company. He then headed back to Washington, where he was able to convince congressional leaders, as well as President Lincoln, who signed the Pacific Railroad Act into law the following year. Unfortunately, it would take months of discussion in Congress to determine the route. In 1862, the Pacific Railroad Act chartered the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific Railroad Companies and tasked them with building a transcontinental railroad that would link the United States from the east all the way to the west. The Central Pacific would start building in Sacramento and continue east across the Sierra Nevada, and the Union Pacific Railroad would build westward from the Missouri River near the Iowa-Nebraska border. The 2 lines of track would meet in the middle at an undetermined location at this point, and each company would receive 6,400 acres of land and $48,000 in government bonds for every mile of track that was built. Thus began the competition between the 2 companies. The Central Pacific was dominated by the Big Four: Charles Crocker, Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, and Mark Hopkins, ambitious businessmen with no prior experience with railroads, engineering, or construction. They borrowed heavily to finance the project and exploited legal loopholes to get the most possible funds from the government for their planned track construction. Disillusioned with his partners, Judah planned to recruit new investors to buy them out. But he caught yellow fever while crossing the Isthmus of Panama on his way east and died in November of 1863, soon after the Central Pacific had spiked its first rails to ties in Sacramento. Meanwhile, in Omaha, Dr. Thomas Durant had illegally achieved a controlling interest in the Union Pacific Railroad Company, giving him complete authority over the project. Though the Union Pacific celebrated its own launch in early December 1863, little would be completed until the end of the Civil War in 1865. Finally, the Union Pacific began to move western in May of 1866 after General Grenville Dodge, a hero of the Union Army, took control as chief engineer. Despite attacks on the workers by Native Americans, who were understandably threatened by the progress of the white man and his iron horse across their native lands, still, the Union Pacific managed to move relatively quickly across the plains, compared to the much slower progress of their rival company through the Sierras. Ramshackle settlements popped up wherever the railroad went, turning into hotbeds of drinking, gambling, prostitution, and violence, and producing the enduring mythology of the Wild West. The western leg of the railroad struggled with retraining workers due to the difficulty of the labor, and they began to hire laborers from more than the 50,000 Chinese immigrants that were living on the West Coast, many having arrived during the gold rush. This was very controversial at the time, as the Chinese were considered an inferior race due to pervasive racism. By contrast, the workforce of the Union Pacific were mainly Irish immigrants and Civil War veterans. By the summer of 1867, the Union Pacific had made it to Wyoming, having covered nearly 4 times as much ground as the Central Pacific. The Central Pacific broke through the mountains in late June, and the hard part was finally behind them. Both companies then headed for Salt Lake City, cutting lots of corners, including building shoddy bridges or sections of track that would later have to be rebuilt. But they raced to get ahead. By early 1869, the companies were working only miles from each other, and in March, the newly inaugurated President Ulysses S. Grant announced he would withhold federal funds until the two companies could agree on a meeting point. They decided on Promontory Summit north of the Great Salt Lake, some 690 track miles from Sacramento and 1,086 miles from Omaha. On May 10th, after several delays, a crowd of workers and dignitaries watched as the final spike was driven, linking the Central Pacific and Union Pacific in the Golden Spike ceremony. The Golden Spike was made of 17.6 karat gold and was a gift of David Hughes, a San Francisco contractor and friend of Big Four member Leland Stanford. During the ceremony, Stanford took the first swing at the spike, but accidentally struck the tie instead. His attempt was followed by Union Pacific Thomas Durant, who also swung and missed. Finally, a railroad worker ultimately drove the final spike at 12:47 p.m. on May 10th of 1869. Telegraph cables immediately went out to President Grant and around the country with news that the Transcontinental Railroad had been completed. The golden spike was removed after the ceremony and replaced with a traditional iron spike. 3 other ties, one of gold, one of silver, and another one of silver, were also presented at the ceremony. The original golden spike is now part of the collection at Stanford University, which was founded by Leland Stanford and his wife in 1885 in memory of their son. The resulting coast-to-coast railroad connection revolutionized the settlement and economy of the American West. It brought the western states and territories into alignment with the northern Union states and made transporting passengers and goods coast to coast quicker, safer, and less expensive. The first transcontinental rail passengers arrived at the Pacific Railroad's original western terminus at the Alameda Terminal on September 6, 1869, where they then transferred to the steamer Alameda for transport across the bay to San Francisco. I hope you've enjoyed today's moment in history. If you want to learn even more history, please stop by my blog that's found on my website at www.lindashentonmatchett.com. Please consider subscribing to my channel and click the bell icon to receive notification of new episodes that generally release on the 2nd and 4th Fridays of each month. Thanks for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.